I worked inside Michael Jackson's estate after his death. And what I saw still shocks me. Not because of some wild conspiracy theory you've already heard 100 times. Not because of tabloid gossip or celebrity drama. I'm talking about something far more sinister. Something that happened in the dark. Something that was completely legal. See, when a legend dies, everyone assumes their legacy gets protected. That their life's work gets preserved. That museums and archives fight to keep their memory alive. But that's not what I witnessed. What I saw was the systematic dismantling of an entire genius. Piece by piece, item by item, erased from existence while the world was still crying outside the gates. I'm telling you this now because I've carried this weight for years. And I can't stay silent anymore. Because the real story, the one that will haunt you, is what actually happened behind those closed doors when nobody was watching. You need to hear what I saw. I wasn't supposed to be there. That's the first thing you need to understand. I was burned out. Completely. I'd spent 15 years as a restoration specialist, working in museums, private collections, archives that nobody visits, fixing old things, preserving forgotten things. And somewhere along the way, the magic died. I was just going through the motions. Paycheck to paycheck, no passion, no purpose. Just me in a basement somewhere, cataloging items that the world had already forgotten about. Then came the call. It was a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice. Professional. Cold. She said 3 things that made me listen. We know your work. We have a project. And we're prepared to pay you more than you've made in your entire career. I should have asked questions. I didn't. She continued. But this requires complete discretion. You'll sign an NDA. You'll work alone. You won't discuss this with anyone. Not your family, not your friends, not a therapist. Do you understand? Red flag. Massive red flag. But she'd already said the magic word. Money. Enough money to change my life. Enough money to finally breathe. When do I start? I asked. That's how it always happens, isn't it? We see the warning signs. We choose to ignore them because we need something more than we need to be safe. The hiring process was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't an interview. It was an interrogation. I drove to an unmarked warehouse in a part of Los Angeles I'd never been to. No signage, no company name. Just a gray building that looked like it could house anything or hide anything. There were metal detectors at the entrance. Metal detectors. Like I was entering a government facility, not accepting a job offer. A man in a suit, no name given, escorted me through a series of corridors, each one more secured than the last. He handed me documents. Thick documents. Pages and pages of legal language that all boiled down to one thing. If you talk, we will destroy you. Do you understand the gravity of the situation? He asked. I nodded. I didn't understand it, but I nodded anyway. What you're about to see is the private collection of Michael Jackson. It has never been cataloged. It has never been properly inventoried. Your job is to restore, preserve, and document everything you find. You will work alone. You will work at night. You will not ask questions about the chain of command or the ultimate purpose of this project. Michael Jackson. The words hit different. This wasn't some forgotten heirs collection. This wasn't a wealthy businessman's private archive. This was Michael Jackson, the king of pop, the most famous entertainer who ever lived. We chose you because you know how to work quietly, the man continued. Because you understand that some things are meant to be preserved in private. Because you can be trusted to keep your mouth shut. I should have walked out. Everything inside me screamed to walk out. Instead, I signed the documents. The first time I walked into that archive, I stopped breathing. The warehouse was massive, climate-controlled, organized into sections like a museum, except there were no tourists, no plaques, no context, just endless rows of materials, recordings, instruments, personal documents, photographs, home videos, things that belonged in the Smithsonian, things that belonged in the world. There were master recordings I'd never heard before, instrumental versions of songs I'd grown up with, demos, experiments, raw vocal takes that showed the creative process in real time. You could hear Michael Jackson thinking, solving problems, creating magic in a studio, one take at a time. There were instruments everywhere, keyboards he'd played, guitars, drums, basses. Some of them looked like they'd never been used. Some looked like they'd been worn smooth by his hands. There were letters, handwritten, personal, vulnerable. There were journals. There were recordings that sounded like diary entries. Michael's voice, just him, talking about his thoughts, his fears, his dreams, his pain. And there were photographs. Michael as a child, Michael as a teenager, Michael as an adult. Candid shots, unguarded moments, the human being behind the icon. I stood there in the middle of that warehouse for what felt like hours, just absorbing the weight of it. This wasn't just a collection. This was a life. An entire human existence reduced to materials in a climate-controlled room. It's overwhelming, isn't it? A voice said behind me. I turned. A woman in her 60s stood there. She had kind eyes, which somehow made it worse. "What is all of this?" I asked. "His legacy," she said simply. "Everything he created, everything he was, everything the world will never see." That last part stuck with me. Everything the world will never see. Why? I asked. Why keep it hidden? She looked at me for a long moment. Then she walked away without answering. That's when I should have realized something was wrong. Not the metal detectors, not the NDAs, not the secrecy, but that phrase, everything the world will never see. Because a genius's work isn't meant to be hidden. It's meant to be shared. It's meant to change people. It's meant to live. But she'd said it wouldn't. And somehow, I already knew she was right. My first week, I was given a simple assignment. Create a master inventory of everything in the archive. Document it, photograph it, catalog it by type, by date, by subject matter. Simple, right? It wasn't simple. It was impossible. There was too much. Thousands of items. Some of them crumbling. Some of them damaged. Some of them so fragile they looked like they'd disintegrate if you breathed on them. But I started anyway. Night after night. Just me. Alone in that warehouse. Surrounded by the ghost of Michael Jackson. And as I worked, I began to understand the scope of what I was looking at. This wasn't just a collection. This was evidence of genius. Pure, undeniable, incomparable genius. Every recording showed evolution. Every journal entry showed depth. Every letter showed a human being wrestling with the weight of being Michael Jackson. The isolation, the pressure, the constant scrutiny, the love he had for his children, the betrayals he'd suffered, the art he needed to create just to survive. This archive was a window into his soul, and I was the only person in the world who got to see it. That should have felt like an honor. Instead, it felt like a burden. But I had no idea that what I was looking at wasn't being preserved. It was being erased. By the second week, I noticed something was off. It started small, subtle, the kind of thing you almost convince yourself you imagined. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. I'd catalog an item, document it, take photographs, file it in the system. And then, days later, it would be gone. Not moved, not relocated to a different section. Gone. Vanished from the archive like it had never existed. The first time it happened, I thought I'd made a mistake. Maybe I'd miscategorized something. Maybe I'd confused two items. So I checked my notes. I checked my photographs. I checked the system. No, I had documented it correctly. The item had been there, and now it wasn't. I asked one of the night staff, a quiet man named Marcus who worked security, if items ever got moved around. Not that I know of, he said. He wouldn't make eye contact. Do you know where this went? I showed him my photograph and the inventory number. He looked at the photo. His jaw tightened. No, he said. You shouldn't ask about that. Shouldn't ask. Not couldn't answer. Shouldn't ask. That's when the dread started creeping in. It happened more frequently after that. Items disappearing, master recordings, personal documents, letters, journals. Whole sections of the archive being quietly dismantled while I watched helplessly. I started keeping my own backup records off the system. In a notebook I kept hidden because I needed to know what was happening. I needed to track what was being stolen from this place. And yes, I was beginning to think of it as stealing, because that's what it was. One night, I found a room I'd never seen before. It was locked. I asked about it. That's not your area. A man I'd never met before told me. He had the look of a lawyer, expensive suit, cold eyes. Your work is in section A through D. That room doesn't exist as far as you're concerned. What's in there? I asked. Items that are being handled separately. Handled how? That's not your concern. But it was my concern, because I was beginning to understand that handled separately meant destroyed or sold off or hidden from the world. The real moment of realization came about 3 weeks in. I was working late, which was always, when I heard voices coming from the locked room. I shouldn't have listened. I should have kept my head down, kept working, kept my mouth shut. But I didn't. I moved closer, just enough to hear. A woman's voice. These need to go. All of them. A man's voice. The lawyer from before. The personal journals. Especially the journals. They're too vulnerable, too honest. They don't serve the narrative we're building. What about the recordings? The unreleased tracks? Separate them. The commercially viable ones go to the estate's vaults for future release. Everything else gets destroyed. My blood went cold. The family knows about this? The man asked. The family knows what they need to know, and they're being compensated for their discretion. That's when I realized this wasn't chaos. This wasn't incompetence. This was organized. This was planned. This was business. Someone had made a decision about Michael Jackson's legacy, and that decision was, only the parts that make money stay. Everything else, the vulnerable parts, the honest parts, the human parts, gets eliminated. I couldn't sleep that night. I went back through my hidden records, tried to figure out what pattern I was missing. What logic was guiding these decisions? And slowly, it became clear. The items being kept were the ones that had commercial value, the ones that could be released as posthumous albums, the ones that could generate revenue for the estate. Everything else was being destroyed. A journal entry where Michael Jackson talked about his fears? Gone. A recording where he was just experimenting, not creating a finished song? Destroyed. A letter to someone he loved? Disappeared. A home video of him being vulnerable, being human, being himself? Erased. It was like someone was curating a version of Michael Jackson that only existed to make money. And they were systematically eliminating the real version. The genius, the vulnerability, the depth, the humanity, all of it being deleted. I made a mistake around day 25. I asked directly where a specific item had gone. It was a recording, not a famous song. Just Michael's voice, talking, thinking out loud about creativity and pain and loneliness. I'd listened to it once, just once, and I'd heard something in it that broke my heart. I'd heard a man who was struggling, a man who was searching for meaning, a man who was desperately, achingly human. When it disappeared from the archive, I couldn't let it go. "Where's this recording?" I asked the woman who supervised the separate handling room. She looked at me like I'd asked her to commit murder. "That's not your department," she said. "But it was in my inventory. I documented it, and now it's been reclassified, removed from the catalog, archived separately." "Why? It's a masterpiece. Michael's voice, his thoughts, his..." "That's exactly why," she interrupted. "It's too personal. It's too revealing. Some of Michael Jackson needs to stay private." Private? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "It's his genius. It belongs, she said, cutting me off, "to whoever has the power to decide what happens to it. And that's not you." She turned and walked away, but not before I saw something in her face. Not cruelty, not malice, resignation. Like she was following orders she didn't agree with. Like she was complicit in something she hated. Like she'd made peace with the fact that the right thing and the profitable thing were never going to be the same. That's when I realized I had a choice to make. I could keep my head down, do my job, take the money, forget what I'd seen. Convince myself that it wasn't my responsibility. That I was just a restoration specialist, not a moral authority. That what happened to Michael Jackson's archive wasn't my problem. Or I could acknowledge what was happening and become complicit in it. There was no third option. There was no report this to authorities option. There was no blow the whistle and be a hero option. Because I'd signed an NDA that basically said, if you talk, your life is over. So the choice was really just, how do you live with yourself? I didn't have an answer that night, but I knew I had to find one. Because every day I stayed in that archive, more items disappeared. More of Michael Jackson's real self was being erased. More of his vulnerability was being locked away or destroyed. And I was watching it happen. I was enabling it to happen. But I had no idea that this was only the beginning. The real devastation was about to start. And when I tried to do something about it, everything would fall apart. I became obsessed. Not in a healthy way. In the way that keeps you awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, your mind racing through scenarios you can't control. In the way that makes you paranoid. In the way that makes you dangerous. I started following the money. It sounds cliche. Follow the money, find the truth. But it's cliche because it works. Because human beings are predictable. We leave trails, we make records, We think we're smarter than we are. So I did something I shouldn't have done. Something that violated my contract. Something that could have gotten me arrested. I started digging through files that weren't my responsibility. The separate handling room had a filing system, and that filing system had names, addresses, bank accounts, transactions, a complete paper trail of where Michael Jackson's archive items were going and who was paying for them. I couldn't access it directly. The room was locked, but I could see into it through a crack in the door when they left it open. And I had a good memory, so I memorized names, numbers, dates, amounts. And what I found made me understand that this wasn't about preserving Michael Jackson's legacy. It was about selling it, piece by piece, to the highest bidder. Let me explain how estate liquidation works. When a celebrity dies, their estate, all their possessions, their intellectual property, their creations, becomes a commodity. It gets divided among heirs. It gets taxed. It gets managed by professionals whose job is to maximize value. And maximizing value means what's worth the most money? A master recording? Millions. A journal entry? Less so, unless it's sensational. A home video of Michael with his kids? Depends on whether it's heartwarming or controversial. But here's the thing. The people managing Michael Jackson's estate weren't just selling items. They were curating what the world would see. They were deciding which parts of him were worth money and which parts were worth destroying. And the most dangerous items, the ones that threatened the narrative they'd built, those were being systematically eliminated. I started recognizing patterns in the transactions. Items that were personal or vulnerable disappeared and reappeared as destroyed or lost in transit. Items that were commercially viable got transferred to auction houses, private collectors, or music labels. But there was a third category. Items that were being sold to specific people. The same names kept appearing over and over. One name appeared more than any other. Victoria Strand. I didn't recognize the name at first, but I started seeing it everywhere. She was buying everything. Personal documents, unreleased recordings, photographs, letters. She was systematically acquiring pieces of Michael Jackson's private life. Who was Victoria Strand? I did something else I shouldn't have done. I looked her up. What I found was worse than I expected. Victoria Strand was a documentary filmmaker. Not just any documentary filmmaker. She was known for one thing: creating exposés about celebrities, taking their secrets, taking their vulnerabilities, taking their private moments and broadcasting them to millions of people. She had made films about 3 other celebrities. In each case, she'd acquired their private materials through estate liquidation. In each case, she'd used those materials to create deeply personal, invasive documentaries that had destroyed reputations and careers. And now she was acquiring Michael Jackson's private archive. The implications were immediate and horrifying. Someone, I didn't know who, was systematically selling Michael Jackson's most vulnerable moments to a filmmaker known for exploiting them. And they were destroying everything else so that when the documentary came out, it would be the only narrative, the only story, the only truth. Michael Jackson wouldn't be able to defend himself. He wouldn't be able to explain or contextualize or push back. He'd just be there, vulnerable, exposed, exploited, while someone else told his story for profit. And the people managing his estate were facilitating this. Either knowingly or unknowingly, they were complicit. I had to tell someone. That was my first instinct, tell someone. Go to the media. Go to the family. Go to the authorities. Expose what was happening before it was too late. But there was a problem. I'd signed an NDA, a comprehensive, legally binding agreement that said if I disclosed any of this information, I'd be sued into oblivion. My life would be destroyed. I'd never work again. I'd be known as the person who violated the most famous confidentiality agreement in modern history. The people who'd hired me knew this. That's why they'd made me sign it. That's why they'd been so explicit about the consequences. They'd built a cage and handed me the key, but made sure I was too afraid to use it. So I did the only thing I could do. I gathered evidence. I started documenting everything I could see. I photographed the filing system through the crack in the door. I memorized more names, more amounts, more transaction details. I built a case against them without being able to prove I had access to the information I needed. It was risky, insanely risky. If they caught me, I was done. But I was past the point of caring about my own safety because something bigger was happening. Something that transcended contract law and confidentiality agreements. A genius was being erased. His vulnerability was being weaponized. His private moments were being sold to someone who would use them to destroy his memory. And I was one of the few people in the world who knew it was happening. I made contact with a journalist I knew. Not in person, not through any traceable channel. I created an anonymous email account. I sent her a summary of what I'd found. No names, no specific dates, no information that could directly trace back to me. Just, someone is acquiring Michael Jackson's private archive and selling it to a filmmaker known for creating invasive exposés. The estate is facilitating this. It's happening now. You need to investigate. She responded within hours. This is huge. Can you get me proof? I couldn't. Not without violating my NDA. Not without destroying my life. So I told her, I'm working on it. But even as I said it, I knew I was lying because the only way to prove what was happening was to break my contract. And I wasn't brave enough to do that. Not yet. That night, something changed. I was working in the archive, cataloging items that I knew were going to disappear, when I found something they'd missed. Something that hadn't been put in the separate handling room yet. It was a recording. Michael's voice, talking about legacy. He was saying, I want to be remembered for my art. Not for the chaos, not for the scandals, for the music, for the love I tried to put into every song, for the person I tried to be. And then he said something that destroyed me. Please protect my truth. After I'm gone, protect my truth. Don't let them turn me into something I wasn't. Don't let them use my vulnerability against me. Just protect my truth. I listened to that recording 3 times, and I made a decision. I was gonna break my NDA. I was gonna expose this. I didn't know how, I didn't know when. But I knew I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try. Because Michael Jackson had asked. I had the power to answer, but I had no idea that trying to do the right thing would trigger a response I couldn't have anticipated. That the people protecting this secret would stop at nothing to keep it hidden, and that the cost of my conscience would be far higher than I'd ever imagined. They knew. I don't know how they found out. Maybe they monitored my email. Maybe they had cameras in the archive I didn't know about. Maybe the journalist I contacted wasn't as careful as I thought. But somehow, they knew I'd been digging. They knew I'd contacted the media. They knew I was planning to break my NDA, and they were done with me. It happened on a Thursday night. I was working late, as usual, when the lawyer appeared. The same cold-eyed man from my first day. Except this time he wasn't alone. He had two other people with him. A woman in business casual. A man who looked like security. "We need to talk," the lawyer said. My stomach dropped. "About what?" I asked, playing dumb. "About your email to Jessica Chen at the Los Angeles Times. About your unauthorized access to restricted files. About your decision to violate your confidentiality agreement." There it was. They had me. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said. "Yes, you do." The lawyer pulled out a folder. Inside were printed emails. My emails. The ones I'd sent anonymously. "You contacted a journalist. You've been accessing files outside your designated area. You've been documenting materials you were specifically instructed not to document." My hands were shaking. "We have a choice," he continued, "and I'm going to present both options very clearly so there's no confusion about what's about to happen." He set the folder down on the table between us. Option 1. You sign a settlement agreement. It includes a $1 million payment to you, but it also includes a permanent injunction against you ever discussing this project, this archive, this facility, or anyone who works here. You sign an affidavit stating that everything you claim to have discovered was false. You recant any statements you've made to the press. You disappear. Or you take the money and you never speak about this again. I stared at him. Option 2. We prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law. We sue you for breach of contract. We sue you for theft of proprietary information. We pursue criminal charges for computer fraud and unauthorized access to restricted systems. We make sure that every future employer knows you're a liability. We make sure your life becomes a legal nightmare that doesn't end for years." He paused. "Which option do you prefer?" I should have taken the money. Looking back, I should have absolutely taken the money. $1 million. Silence. A fresh start. I could have walked away. Clean. I could have lived with the knowledge that I'd tried and failed, but at least I'd tried. Instead, I said, "What about the documentary? What about Victoria Strand?" The lawyer's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the room. The security guy tensed. The woman in business casual leaned back slightly. "What about her?" the lawyer asked carefully. "She's going to use Michael's private materials to create an invasive documentary that destroys his legacy. You're facilitating that, and you're destroying everything else, so there's no alternative narrative. You're erasing the real Michael Jackson." The lawyer was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "You really don't understand what's happening here, do you?" he said. "You think this is about Michael Jackson? You think it's about his legacy or his truth or protecting his memory? Isn't it?" I asked. "No," he said. "It's about money. It's always about money. Michael Jackson's estate is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. That money goes to his children, to his mother, to various trusts and foundations. Our job, my job, is to maximize that value, to make sure every asset generates as much revenue as possible." He stood up. "Victoria Strand is paying 8 figures for his private archive. 8 figures. Do you understand what that means? That means his children will have generational wealth. That means his family will be secure for the rest of their lives. That means the Michael Jackson Foundation will have more money to do good work than it ever dreamed possible." "But at what cost?" I asked. "At the cost of his dignity? At the cost of his truth?" Yes, the lawyer said simply. At that cost. Because dignity doesn't pay medical bills. Truth doesn't send kids to college. Money does. He leaned down, looking me directly in the eyes. The real Michael Jackson, the vulnerable one, the struggling one, the flawed one, that version generates more revenue than the genius version ever will. Because pain sells, vulnerability sells, scandal sells. So we're not erasing him. We're packaging him. We're turning his private moments into a product that will generate millions of dollars for his family. That's insane, I whispered. That's business, he corrected. So what happens now? I asked. The lawyer straightened up. Now you make a choice. And you need to understand something very clearly. If you go to the media with this information, we will destroy you. Not metaphorically, literally. We will use our resources and our legal team to ensure that your life becomes unlivable. He gestured to the woman in business casual. She slid a document across the table. This is the settlement agreement. Read it, sign it, take the money, walk away, live your life. I looked at the document. $1 million. Freedom. The chance to forget any of this ever happened. And if I don't sign, I asked, then we proceed with legal action. We also notify your previous employers that you're a security risk. We make sure that Jessica Chen at the LA Times knows that you're an unreliable source with a history of mental health issues. Which, by the way, we can document if necessary. That's not true, I said. Truth is irrelevant, he replied. What matters is what we can prove. And we can prove a lot of things. And he stood there, waiting. I looked at the settlement agreement again. Looked at the $1 million figure. Thought about what it could mean for my life. Then I thought about Michael Jackson, alone in that archive, vulnerable, exposed, being commodified and packaged and sold to the highest bidder. I need to think about it, I said. You have 24 hours, the lawyer said. After that, we proceed with option 2. And believe me, option 2 is going to be very, very expensive for you. They left me alone in the archive. I didn't sleep that night. I walked through the warehouse, looked at all the materials that were being slowly, systematically erased. The recordings, the journals, the photographs, the evidence of a human being. And I realized something. The lawyer was right. The money was gonna help Michael Jackson's family. His kids would have resources. His foundation would have power. But at what cost? I thought about Michael's voice on that recording. Protect my truth. Was his truth worth $1 million to me? The next morning, I didn't sign the settlement agreement. Instead, I went to a journalist I trusted more than Jessica Chen, someone with better connections, better resources, better protection against legal retaliation. I told her everything, and I braced myself for what would come next. I thought I was prepared for the consequences. I thought I understood what was about to happen. But I had no idea that breaking my silence would unleash forces far more powerful than a lawyer and a settlement agreement. I had no idea that the people protecting this secret would go to extremes I couldn't have imagined. And I had no idea that my attempt to protect Michael Jackson's legacy would nearly destroy my own life. The story broke on a Sunday morning. Michael Jackson's private archive being sold to invasive filmmaker. Estate liquidating legends most. Vulnerable moments for profit, the headline read. For about 6 hours, I felt like I'd won. Then the consequences started. By noon, my phone was ringing. Lawyers. Lots of lawyers. multiple law firms calling on behalf of different entities. The message was consistent. You violated your NDA. You're going to be sued. By 2 p.m., I'd been officially served with a cease and desist letter. By 4 p.m., there were 3 separate lawsuits filed against me. By 6 p.m., my bank accounts had been frozen. The financial devastation happened faster than I could process it. By Monday morning, the counter-narrative had begun. A statement from the estate: the claims made in this article are false and defamatory. A statement from Victoria Strand: I'm a documentary filmmaker acquiring materials through legal channels. A statement from the lawyer's firm: our client has acted with complete transparency and legality. And then came the personal attacks. Anonymous sources, probably paid by the estate's PR team, began leaking information about me. I had mental health issues. I'd been fired from previous jobs for theft. I was bitter. I was doing this for attention. None of it was true. But truth didn't matter anymore. My identity leaked on Wednesday. Within hours, every major outlet had picked it up. The attacks intensified immediately. People I knew started distancing themselves. Friends didn't return calls. Family members were uncomfortable being associated with my name. My previous employers released statements denying they knew me. I'd become toxic, but the worst part was the online harassment. Social media accounts dedicated to attacking me. Hundreds of people telling me I was crazy, that I was lying, that I was a nobody trying to make myself important by attacking a beloved icon. The estate had successfully reframed the entire story. I was the villain now. The lawsuits got worse. Defamation, tortious interference, conspiracy. They were throwing everything at me, hoping something would stick. My lawyer said the same thing over and over. They're trying to bankrupt you. They're trying to make the cost of fighting them higher than the cost of surrendering. Will it work? I asked. Probably, he said. I started looking at my finances. The $1 million settlement I'd rejected would have paid for years of legal fees. Instead, I had nothing. My savings were being drained. My future was being mortgaged to lawyers. And I still didn't know if I'd win. 3 weeks after the story broke, Victoria Strand released a statement. She said she was indefinitely postponing her documentary. Not canceling, just postponing. Which meant she'd pause long enough for the controversy to die down, then release it anyway, with better legal protection. The journalist called me. That's not a victory. That's a delay, she said. The story's dying. People are moving on. In a few months, nobody will care. And then she'll release the documentary and it'll generate even more buzz. I hadn't thought about it that way. I'd exposed what was happening, but the estate had won anyway. They'd destroyed my life to protect their business model. And it had worked. My lawyer suggested a settlement. They're willing to drop the lawsuits. They want another NDA, and they're offering $500,000. I looked at the offer. Not enough to repair my life, but enough to survive while I tried to rebuild. What happens if I don't take it? I asked. We keep fighting. But even if you win, you lose. Legal fees will consume whatever settlement you get. Your reputation will be destroyed forever. You'll never work in your field again. He paused. Sometimes protecting your life means accepting that you've already lost the war. I was about to sign when something happened. A package arrived at my door. No return address. Inside was a USB drive. I plugged it in. Thousands of files, recordings, documents, emails, internal communications from the estate. Proof of everything I'd claimed. Everything the lawyers had denied. There was a note. The truth deserves to be protected. No signature. Just the evidence that someone inside the estate, someone with everything to lose, had decided that Michael Jackson's truth was worth more than their own safety. I called my lawyer immediately. "This changes everything," he said. "With this, we don't settle. We countersue. We go to trial. We win." But I was thinking about something else. Someone had broken the law to give me this evidence. Someone had risked their career, their freedom, their life to provide proof. That person had truly sacrificed everything. And as I looked at that evidence, I realized the real breaking point wasn't mine. It was theirs. Someone inside the machine had finally broken. But what I didn't realize was that this evidence would trigger a response so severe, so calculated, so devastating that it would make everything before look like a gentle prelude. The evidence changed everything. With those files, my lawyer went from defensive to offensive. We filed countersuits. We demanded depositions. We forced the estate's lawyers to answer questions under oath, and they crumbled. Within 2 weeks, settlement negotiations began in earnest. Not the defensive settlements they'd been offering. Real negotiations. The kind where both sides know they're going to lose if this goes to trial. The final settlement was substantial. 7 figures. An admission of wrongdoing. Carefully worded, of course, but an admission nonetheless. A public apology from the estate, acknowledging that materials from Michael Jackson's archive had been mishandled and improperly liquidated. The NDA was lifted, partially. I could speak about the general facts of what happened, but not about specific individuals or methods. It was enough. But here's what still shocks me. Even after all of this, after the lawsuits, after the evidence, after the settlement, after the admission of wrongdoing, Victoria Strand still released her documentary. Not immediately. She waited 2 years. She waited until the media cycle had moved on, until people had stopped paying attention, until the controversy had faded from public memory. Then she released it. And it was exactly what I'd feared. Invasive, exploitative, framing Michael Jackson's vulnerability as pathology, his privacy as secrecy, his humanity as scandal. It generated millions of dollars. It won awards at film festivals. Critics called it bold and uncompromising and a necessary reckoning. What they meant was, it was profitable. The documentary didn't get stopped. It didn't get prevented. It got delayed. And delay, as it turns out, is sometimes all you need to win. But here's what shocks me even more. The person who'd given me the evidence, the whistleblower inside the estate, they were never identified, never prosecuted, never caught. Which means one of two things. Either they were protected by someone powerful inside the organization, or they were never discovered. Either way, they sacrificed everything and disappeared into silence. I never found out who they were. I wanted to. I tried to. But the trail was too careful, too professional. Whoever they were, they understood how to disappear. Sometimes I wonder if they regret it. If they watch the documentary and think, I gave my life for this, and it happened anyway. Or if they found peace in knowing they'd tried, that they'd done what conscience demanded, even though it didn't change the outcome. Here's what else still shocks me. The whistleblower's sacrifice broke something open. After my story went public and the evidence emerged, other people started coming forward. Other employees, other witnesses, other people who'd seen what was happening inside the estate and had been too scared to speak up. They told stories about destroyed recordings, about journals that had been lost in transit, about photographs that had been deliberately damaged, about a systematic effort to control Michael Jackson's narrative even after his death. The estate denied everything, but the pattern was undeniable. And slowly, very slowly, the public narrative started to shift. Michael Jackson's children sued the estate, not immediately, not publicly at first. They sued to gain control of their father's archive and ensure that future liquidation and documentary projects would require their approval. They won. This wasn't a complete victory. There were compromises. There were negotiations. But the fundamental principle was established. Michael Jackson's family had the right to protect his legacy. The estate's lawyers, the same ones who'd tried to destroy me, had to answer to the Jackson family for what they'd done. And that, somehow, felt like justice. But here's what really still shocks me. After everything was over, after the settlements and the lawsuits and the public apology, I was invited to speak at a conference about whistleblowing and corporate accountability. I stood in front of 500 people and told my story. And afterward, a woman came up to me. She was in her 50s, professional, composed, but her hands were shaking. "I was there," she said, "inside the estate. I saw what was happening. I knew it was wrong, but I was too scared to do what you did." She paused. "Thank you for being brave enough to do what I couldn't." And I realized something that still shocks me to this day. I wasn't brave. I was cornered. I was desperate. I was out of options. Bravery is choosing to do something difficult. When you have a choice, I didn't have a choice. I had consequences. The real brave person was the whistleblower who gave me the evidence. The person who had options and chose to sacrifice them anyway. The person I still don't know. What shocks me most is how little changed. Yes, there was a settlement. Yes, the estate admitted wrongdoing. Yes, Michael Jackson's family gained more control over his legacy. But Victoria Strand still released her documentary. The public still consumed it. The narrative still got framed the way the most powerful people wanted it framed. I thought exposing the truth would change everything. I thought evidence would matter. I thought justice would be served. Instead, I learned that truth is just the opening move in a much longer game. The estate had resources I didn't. They had lawyers better than my lawyers. They had PR people better than any journalist. They had time and money and institutional power. What they didn't have was evidence, so they made me disappear by destroying my life. Then they waited. Then they released the documentary anyway. And the cycle continued. What still shocks me most of all is this. Michael Jackson trusted me with his vulnerability. Not because I was special, not because I was trustworthy, but because I was hired to manage his archive, and he couldn't be there to protect it himself. He was dead. He was silent. He was powerless. And the people with power, the lawyers, the estate managers, the filmmakers, they used that silence against him. They turned his private moments into a commodity. They framed his vulnerability as pathology. They told a story about him that only served their interests. And he couldn't defend himself. That's what still shocks me. Not that corporations are corrupt. Not that the rich have advantages. Not that justice is complicated. What shocks me is that even when you expose the corruption, even when you sacrifice your life, even when you win the lawsuit and get the settlement and force the apology, the person you're trying to protect is still dead. They're still silent. They're still unable to tell their own story. You can fight for their legacy, but you can't give them back their voice. I think about that whistleblower a lot. I think about what they sacrificed. I think about whether they found peace. I think about whether they would do it again, knowing the outcome. I think about Michael Jackson listening to me on that recording, protect my truth. And I think about how I tried, how I sacrificed, how I exposed everything. And it still wasn't enough.